Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in this special S20 webinar on Foresight, part of the S20's webinar series. We definitely thank our host, King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, for their support in organizing this webinar. My name is Yara Rajah, and I'm the S20's Chief Advocacy Officer. Now, we all know that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted that issues and challenges in one part of the world can have far-reaching impacts across the globe. The exponential rates of change that transcends social, economic, political, and technological domains demands a comparable pace and direction of change in governments to be able to respond to it. Because developing robust and future-ready policies requires the convergence of many disciplines. We are so happy that we have an exciting dialogue on Foresight today. We're glad to have a great panel of pioneering experts joining us. And to lead this dialogue, we're absolutely delighted to have Mr. Cyrus Hodes, our moderator for this session. Cyrus Hodes is the co-founder of the AI initiative at the Future Society, where he leads the collective and augmented intelligence against COVID-19 project, together with Stanford Human-Centered AI and Stability AI. Cyrus also co-leads the Global Data Access Framework project with the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General and McKinsey. And without further ado, Cyrus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yara, and thanks Dr. Anas for bringing together the G20 science community to explore one of the most exciting and promising topics of the S20 webinar series, Foresight Science for Navigating Critical Transitions. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought upon us a global critical transition, as well as the acceleration on implementation of long discussed digitalization of societies. I believe the crisis enabled better cooperation of scientists willing to exchange across silos and eager to cooperate and bring truly transdisciplinary vantage points. We are at the decade of action to get to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and many of us feel that the current crisis is also a formidable opportunity to bring a set of new, powerful tools in the hands of policymakers to better navigate this crisis and to get to a successful transition for global economies and societies. If we manage to do so with this pandemic, we will be better prepared for the next one, but also be better prepared and equipped to address future global crises. So we have a truly world-class panel to discuss this, offering academia, government, civil society, and private sector angles. Dr. Anas Al-Faris, who's president of King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology, chair of Science 20. Lord Martin Rees, UK's Astronomer Royal, fellow and former master of Trinity College at Cambridge University, member of the UK House of Lords, co-founder of CAIAC, which is the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Professor Sandy Pentland, co-creator of the MIT Media Lab, MIT's first truly anti-disciplinary department. So I had to look it up, and I found a good definition from former Media Lab director Joy Ito. Anti-disciplinary is about working in spaces that simply do not fit into any existing academic discipline, a specific field of study with its own particular words, frameworks, and methods. Professor Pentland is also a co-founder of the discipline of computational social science, which is transforming the social science to be quantitative and predictive. Emad Mostak is the CEO of Stability.ai and the lead architect of CAIAC, the Collective and Augmented Intelligence Against COVID-19 project, working with multiple UN and other multilateral agencies to map our knowledge on COVID-19 and to help make better decisions faster. Previously, Emad was an award-winning quantitative and fundamental hedge fund manager. Dr. Flavia Schlegel is the Special Envoy for Science on Global Policy at the International Science Council. Prior to joining the Council, Dr. Schlegel held the position of Assistant Director General for UNESCO's Nature's Science sector, where she oversaws UNESCO's response to multilateral development agenda, such as the UN 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. Each panelist will deliver deliver the introduction remarks for 5 minutes. We'll then enter Q&A and discussion till the top of the hour. And then the S20 Foresight Task Force co-leads will present the recommendation, and that's Dr. Yoko Shimpuku, Professor of Global Health Nursing at Hiroshima University, and Dr. Ali Al-Mishari, Upstream Development Strategy Head at Saudi Aramco. Ms. Yara Al-Rajeh, Chief Advocacy Officer of the S20, will then give the closing remarks. So Dr. Anas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cyrus, for the introduction and making it this early. In California, I'm sure it's fairly difficult, so thank you for making it. Well, when you just mentioned this, the anti-disciplinary thing, you've definitely hit a nerve. I was just grilled in a podcast a couple of months ago on the fact that I've also been the anti-disciplinary thing. So it is a fairly confusing term whenever it's thrown out there. Let me start back to the Media Lab, I think, and I'll start there because I think that puts in context some of the ideas that I take personally from the perspective of Foresight. The Media Lab, I was part of the Smart Cities group, and there we were looking at developing systems for making cities a bit smarter, and however that may entail. Later, when I moved to the Engineering Systems Division at MIT, we were trying to look at, and even later in the Institute for Data Systems and Society, we were looking at trying to understand systems and how the world where we live in is highly integrated and interconnected as well. And from there, I went on to work on establishing what was called the Center for Complex Engineering Systems, or CCS for short, between CAIAC and MIT. And within that context, the focus I started with, and the team, we were looking at the question of how can we better design cities? How can we make better cities and plan them? And to really understand how we go about that planning exercise, we needed to know more about the analysis of what these cities are made of, how do we go about it, and what have you. And in that regard, we went on looking at both what we term hard systems or soft systems, or the infrastructure versus the services, if you may. And we went on developing these fairly sophisticated mathematical models that were trying to mimic hard systems like energy systems or transportation systems on one end, and then on the other end, some soft systems, such as the health systems or labor systems. And we quickly learned that those systems, of course, do not live in silos. They're integrated, they're interconnected. And so we needed to also look at how these systems are linked to the social systems as well. And so the human really at the center of all of this. But on the other end as well, we needed to look at how these systems were affecting the environment or being affected by the environment as well. So now we were looking at a little larger context for all of this, where we started now bringing in these externalities as well. And when we started going back to that same question of what does it really mean to develop or design a better city, it's a fairly multi-objective problem. It's a fairly complex problem for that matter. And when we started asking questions on, even within a city, this question of scale, are we looking at it at the neighborhood level? Are we looking at it at the full city level? Or even are we looking at it at the national or even beyond at the global level? These systems reacted fairly differently. We're talking about, of course, COVID and affecting the health system is one that started with, that has affected, of course, on multiple scales in that regard. Now, then comes this question of uncertainty. And as we look at these systems, we started looking at how do we understand those uncertainties? And I'm sure Lord Martin Rees will expand significantly on the future uncertainties and what we expect in the future of such. But as we look at these systems, we really understand that this idea of interconnectedness, this idea of that these systems, we might understand the first order effect that might occur at one system, but then the second, third order, or nth order effects are really much harder to really understand or unravel, really starts to show where this complexity of these systems really occurs. Just to give more of an example, I'm sure some of you remember in the late 1990s with the Pan Am satellite communication galaxy, when it went off orbit, although that was in the communication realm, quickly affected, of course, the communication realm in the US, but it also affected quickly the pagers of doctors in hospitals. It impacted over 80% of those pagers, for those who still remember pagers. And that affected quickly the health system, where doctors weren't able to provide the services they were needed to provide, and the full health system started being affected quickly. But even beyond this, doctors started moving quickly, and the health practitioners as well, moving quickly towards hospitals, which even caused immense traffic jams around many of these hospitals. So we start seeing that although it started at one system, which was the communication system, propagated very quickly into the health system, and from there even into the transportation system. And today, of course, with COVID-19, we see significantly much larger impacts of catastrophe happening in one domain, propagating very quickly across many domains, affecting supply chains on one end, travel on the other, tourism, labor, and beyond. Back to the center, we started also trying to develop tools, pushing really the boundaries on a lot of this. And I know Sandy has been, I'm sure he'll talk about a lot of the techniques and tools that in the connected science they've been working on. And Sandy has been definitely working as well with us on several of those projects, and we've been very proud to have him on those projects. We went on developing components that relate to what we call the connected intelligence platform, in which we were trying, and still are trying, because it's a hard problem, trying to figure out how we not only model these complex systems, but also model the interactions that happen between them. Let me just wrap up with all of this fairly long introduction on what is Foresight from at least my perspective and the way I look at it. Foresight is undoubtedly trying to understand more about what the future holds, and that's critical. But that is to understand a lot of the externalities that we're going to be having, those critical transitions that we will face. But in addition to that as well, understand a lot of the decision variables. Those are the decision variables that are affecting the way we would design these systems, and understand how we react and they react. And this would be the levers, if you may, for a lot of those systems. Finally, understanding the solution space that emerges out of all of this. The solution space of the possible futures that we could see altogether. So by combining those three major components, that to me really is what defines some of what Foresight and Foresight science today should encompass. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anas. Lord Martin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this, and all good wishes for the other preparations for the G20 this year. I am head of a center for the study of extreme risks, as you mentioned in the introduction. And I think an important maxim for us is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. COVID was unfamiliar. We didn't prepare adequately, but we shouldn't have regarded it as improbable because we'd had, as you know, we'd had influenza epidemics, we'd had SARS, we'd had MERS, etc. So we should have been prepared. And the lesson is that we don't know what will actually happen, but far more preparation is needed to ensure that we can cope and are more resilient. And that, I think, is an important message that we're all getting from the present crisis. I'm also an astronomer and sometimes confused with being an astrologer. But I have to say that I can't make any firm predictions because astronomers and scientists are fairly poor forecasters, though not quite as bad as economists in general. But I think there are two things we can forecast if we look ahead towards the middle of the century. I'm now talking about not immediate crises, but long-term crises. The first is that the world is going to be more crowded. The world's population is going up. The birth rate worldwide is not going up, but there's a fast growth in India and sub-Saharan Africa, and that therefore means that the population, which is now about 7.8 billion, is going to rise to about 9 billion by mid-century. And that's fairly predictable, barring any massive disaster, because most people in the world are young and they will live longer and they're yet to have children. So we know that we will have to cope with 9 billion people. And the growth is going to be especially fast in Africa. And I think we've got to make sure that Africa doesn't get left behind too much, not only because it's bad for them, but also for the safety of the world. We've got to avoid these massive digressions. And so this leads to the point that there are certain kinds of technologies which are benign and are going to be especially helpful in that context. And of course, what's most important is going to be sustainable but intensive food production, so that 9 billion people can be fed, given limited land area, as we don't want to encroach on forests, and also given constraints on water. And this therefore means, in my opinion, that we've got to make use of the genetic modification of crops and a very intensive growth of crops. Certainly everyone can't eat like present-day Americans with so much beef, and we've got to have a more vegetarian diet. And probably another technology we ought to aim to foster is artificial meat. This is technically possible, and this would be a very benign development. So in the biological areas, plant science and the development of new foods, and indeed getting protein from insects and other things, is going to be very important if we are to ensure that food production is probably has to be double what it is now, because the population is going up by about 30%, but many people are undernourished at the moment. So we've got to double food production without encroaching on the natural forests and the rest of it. That's one big challenge. And that's aggravated by, of course, the second big challenge that we have, which is dealing with climate change, changes in gross weather patterns and warming. And this is something which is certainly not under-discussed, but it is, of course, under-acted upon, because it's a crisis which isn't an immediate one, but we can predict that it's going to be more serious in the second half of the century. And I think there's an ethical and economic issue here, that if you discount the future in the way some economists do, and in the way, for instance, Born Lomborg and his Copenhagen Consensus do, then of course you say it's less important to deal with climate change than to give more immediate aid to the world's poor. But in this context, it's not right to apply a discount rate which gives no value to the second half of the century, bearing in mind that babies born today will be alive in the 22nd century. So this is a context where you should be prepared to pay a big insurance premium to remove a risk of really serious climate change in the second half of the century. And here again, we need more, but maybe differently directed technology to generate carbon-free energy. And in countries with high technical capability, like mine in England, I argue very strongly that we should prioritize developing clean energy and also all that goes with it, energy storage, smart grids, and the rest of it. And I argue this in my country because we only emit between 1% and 2% of the world's CO2. So even if we aim for net zero by 2050, and we have a legal commitment at the moment to do this, that only makes 1% or 2% difference to the world. But if technologically advanced countries all prioritize clean energy to make it efficient and, more important, affordable to countries like India and Africa, which need more energy per capita, but will build coal-fired power stations if they can't afford to leapfrog to clean energy, then the advanced countries will be doing more for the world. So to prioritize clean energy is something which is good for the world and not just for the countries that are able to do it. And of course, the particular kinds of clean energy, obviously, are very different in my country and in Saudi Arabia, where presumably you've got to have air conditioning and all that, and desalination and all that. So clean energy and all that goes with it should be our priority. Just before I finish, I'd like to mention another issue which I discuss in my recent book called On the Future. It's that we have these threats which are caused by humanity's collective footprint getting greater. That's the threat for food production and climate change. But of course, there's also threats due to the downsides of all the other technologies, bio, cyber, and AI. And clearly here, again, we've got to ensure that we can reap the benefits and minimize the downsides. And the downsides here, particularly of bio and cyber, are that it's possible for just a few people empowered by these technologies to cause massive disruption. We know about cyber attacks. Cyber attacks will get worse. And we also know it will be possible to engineer viruses to make them more virulent and transmissible. That was done with the influenza virus 8 years ago. Hasn't been yet with COVID type viruses, but that may happen too. So we've got to worry about what I call the village idiots who now have a global range. And I think this is going to be a big challenge to governance and produce a big tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, freedom, and security. Different countries will choose the balance differently, but that's going to be a big challenge to governance. And for that reason, I do feel we'll have a bumpy ride through the century. And that's why, to go back to the first thing I said, the important thing is to ensure that countries where the standard of living is now get a chance to catch up and don't get left behind. So to help countries like Sub-Saharan Africa to catch up and meet the millennium, to meet the UN sustainability goals is, I think, a top priority for all of us. I've gone on long enough, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Martin. Professor Pentland, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I enjoyed Lord Reed's comments there. I think they're great analysis. The sort of functional thing I want to talk about is what is the role of science? This is supposed to be science 20 here. And what I see is that science is very much in a 19th century mindset. It's very siloed. There's mechanical engineering and electrical engineering, and they really don't talk to each other. You know, they talk about interdisciplinary, but what that means is you and I will work together, but I won't bother to learn what you do. Right? Well, no, it's the integrative combination of knowledge that opens up white spaces and possibilities. there's also a number of other things that are very 19th century. Like, for instance, medical science is essentially stymied by this notion that randomized controlled trials are the only way to do science. That was invented in 1734, and we have a lot better statistics now. It is possible to make much better use of, say, for instance, all those people who have been treated for COVID to understand which drugs are working and which ones aren't. You can never have a perfect understanding, and RCTs are not perfect, incidentally. That's why we have meta-analyses. Similarly, data. People are, again, sort of focused on things you can do in a laboratory or a clinic. But the moment that COVID hit, many of the companies that do telco and banking and other data released samples of their data, not individual data typically, but more like sort of census-type data. And suddenly you could see that most of the epidemiological models were orders of magnitude off because they didn't take account of social structure. They didn't take account of the sort of normal habits of behavior. And you could dramatically refine these things by combining different sorts of data, not in RCTs, but in these observational and natural experiment sorts of cases. So it's not just health data. We had the case recently where someone got a hold of tax data for the last 30 years. And again, not individual level data, but neighborhood by neighborhood data. And suddenly you could see that most of the poverty alleviation programs in this country did nothing. But the things that did do something were things that enhanced cultural exposure for the very youngest kids. And those had an enormous effect. Not part of the disciplines of psychology or social psychology or sociology, or at least not essential. So it's this idea that you need data, you need to get off of the sort of do it in the lab sort of mindset, you need to combine things to get better sorts of mindsets and better science. So Reese talked about economics, which is a hobby horse of mine also. I mean, the problem with economics is they just deal with money and they don't deal with anything else. And as a consequence, human suffering, human health, peace, all of those sustainability things get put in second place at the very best. So what we've seen is the UN Sustainable Development Goals has a strong initiative to measure all the different factors of society. This is something that I'm on the board of and helped set up. The OECD is now arguing that you have to do much more than just measure money. You have to measure all the other sorts of parts of society to know the correlated impacts that Anas talked about. Right? Even the World Economic Forum, companies are beginning to realize that if they don't take account of all these other factors, it puts them at greater risk. And so they need to begin to take those into their profit and loss. How did you do things to the environment? What did you do things to the culture? Those are critical. So to make this work, we need a couple of changes in our systems. We need to have much more broad available data on the sort of neighborhood by neighborhood basis, at least, not necessarily individual data. We've shown that that gives you about 80% of what you need to get there. You need to break up the departments and silos in universities and funding programs. Those are just putting blinders on us so that we can't do things. And I would argue also that research should be motivated by problems, not by disciplines. So Lord Rees talked about food, talked about climate, talked about some of the other dangers. Those should be core sort of foci within universities and research things. And climate is another example of something that is got blinders on. People talk about carbon all the time. Well, it's not just carbon. It's water, it's soils, it's pollution. Essentially, it's the ecosystem being out of balance. Carbon is part of that. But if you just treat carbon, you're not treating the root causes. You need to get at the whole system. So these are the more holistic, data-rich sciences that are focused on real problems is, I think, the thing that I would like to see the G20 and S20 come out strongly for. And I'll be quiet now.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Very much to the point. Imad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for dialing in from around the world. I think some fantastic points made by Lord Rees, Professor Pentland, and Dr. Alfaris. I think, you know, science comes from the word scientia, which means knowledge. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get to. I think that the COVID crisis, although it's probably infected less than 1% of us, depending on your serological surveys, it's affected all of us. And we're looking already at the second and third order impacts with quite a bit of dismay, because we're seeing the fractures in the way the world used to be. For all of us on this call, it's a massive challenge because the pace of knowledge formation and the mechanisms of that are also changing before our eyes. You know, we have preprints or PDFs on a server suddenly causing massive splashes. We have issues around communications on public health matters. And then we have political factors and other factors changing policy around the world at the drop of a hat. I think one of the most interesting things I saw this year was how the global consensus on masks changed. All it took, as it were, or the proximate cause of that, was a meta-study of 169 different mask analyses. I don't think that study was particularly strong, but it was done. Because in the absence of stability, in a new regime where things are uncertain, we look to authority, we look to comprehensiveness, and we look to who's most up to date. We look to people like who are on these calls to guide us, because ultimately, and I think this is the concept of foresight, we're all looking for a map. We're all looking to get together to see a map to the future. And most roadmaps are not constrained by resources as much as knowledge. Because once you have the knowledge, as Lord Rees said, of the second order impacts coming out of Africa, of the climate change, you can put a value to something as well as knowing the price of something. And this is very important to me as a former hedge fund manager. That's when we can start to get things done. So that's where CAIAC, Collective and Augmented Intelligence Against COVID-19, emerged with the Future Society Stability and Stanford High, along with our partners at the UN. It was saying, can we capture our collective knowledge using a lot of smart people and some computers in an up-to-date, comprehensive and up-to-date manner on key topics to solve solutions? What do you need to know about contact tracing? Well, we've mapped over 200 contact tracing initiatives and the ethics and technology around contact tracing. What do you need to know about targeted aid? We have 500 initiatives in 100 countries. What do you need to know about the infodemic, this massive attack on science that's occurring around the world? Again, we have 150 countries' policies mapped, and we're going further than the infodemic on COVID-19 to incorporate knowledge from counter-extremism, combating online child exploitation, and these other initiatives, because we have to have this holistic view. And so many of us are pulled into this holistic element. We need maps to not break the silos necessarily, because that will take a while, but to start bridging the silos of who's doing what where. And so that's what our platform does. We remove the friction, so any of you can do an interview with us and say what you're doing. And then we can map that interview in almost 30 languages as of next month and start extracting semantically the key knowledge from that. That then goes to an 80-20 mapping of what your country and your organization is doing within this broader map. And we start trying to look for what are the key principles that underlie all this. And this goes to Professor Alfaris's kind of comments about cities. Every city is different and every single situation is different. But when dealing with uncertainty, we want to look at the principles and we want to look at the constraints. And once we start understanding those and we get people on the same page, we can start optimizing for these elements. So I think that, you know, we've tried to set up this initiative as a global collaborative, and we all know how complicated that is. So rather than saying we're going to be objective and analytical, we're saying we're going to make a start. We're going to do better than kind of what's out there to try and create a resource for everyone. And I'd like to invite everyone to collaborate on this, because I think if we get a really good idea of where we are now and where we've been, because most decision support systems are either document or knowledge-based, past and present, then we can start feeding better data in and better knowledge into models for the future. So we can both get on the same page and we can start looking at those future likelihoods, future possibilities, and learn from people who've already experienced this. countries in the global south already experienced the issue of people falling through the nets. We can learn from what they did for targeted aid there. Countries have already experienced further on the timeline for COVID response. And again, we need to learn better about what they do there. So if you'd like to contribute to the knowledge base, you're welcome. If you'd like to participate in the initiative and help shape it, the initiative is informed by its own processes. We'd love to have you on board. And finally, we need to make this useful for policymakers. So we're using some of the modern technology and tools such as dynamic natural language generation across what's likely to be 100 languages by the end of the year on key dynamic reports, natural language semantic search and others. But we'd love to engage with all of you who've had this experience of how do you communicate in such a complicated time and get your insights into how we can make this applicable to the most in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. Dr. Schlegel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Cyrus, and thank you, S20 team and all the task forces for inviting me here to speak on behalf of the International Science Council, a global network partner of S20. And thanks to the excellent points made already by this great panelists. I'd like to make the point on a systemic and inclusive foresight process for a whole of government approach. Why am I saying this? Let me start with foresight. Foresight is, for me, not really a disciplinary science. It's more like a tool or an approach on elaborate on the future, looking forward, forecasting on futures where we are trying to expand on alternative futures. So we're not sort of like exposed to one inevitable future. But it's not only just for the sake of thinking about alternative futures, it really has to do something also with planning. I mean, it's about a strategic analysis so that a government, for example, can set priorities and plan where to invest money when they're discussing a budget. But the future and the planning is also about multi-actor approach. So it's not just one sector of society now thinking about the future. We really need a process here to think about futures, to develop alternatives for futures among different actors in society. So this is about participation. It's about dialogue where maybe one could coordinate, but not sort of like one is a boss and it's just a top-down process. Why is this difficult for the sciences and for policymakers and governments? And I think both Lord Rees, but particularly also Professor Pertland, have made the great points about the 19th century scientific system. And I don't want to repeat how difficult it is to overcome the silo approach and how very little incentives, career options, funding goes in truly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary cooperation and not just parallel working, as Professor Pertland said. And I would not even talk about transdisciplinary, where the science system has to understand that knowledge can also be produced in other sectors of society. So knowledge production is not something which only happens within academia. There are practitioners out there, communities, indigenous knowledge systems where a lot of knowledge is being produced as well. Another point for the science system, I think, which is very difficult, is seniority. As if only elderly men and women successfully lived through an academic career would have the right to have a say. I think we really have to make sure that young people, young scientists, young researchers find a fora to actually be active as well, because I mean, it's mainly about their future and it's the future of themselves and their children. And the last point on the difficulties of the sciences, I guess, is really here on the uncertainties, the predictabilities, and the general expectation of society that scientists speak the truth. Yes, of course, they should speak the truth, but the truth could also be that we don't know. And I guess this again is a very difficult point for policymakers and governance. I mean, in difficult times like pandemic, I mean, the knowledge is changing sort of like from one day or another. And I'm not talking here about silo knowledge. It's also about the interconnected knowledge, so that things which seem to be true a month ago actually change. And I don't think that policymakers really like that. They like very simple messages, because they have to obviously to communicate to a very diverse people, very diverse communities. They're also usually very short-term oriented. I mean, it's either the budget cycle or it's the next election cycle. And I think the future or sustainability doesn't really care about budget and election cycles. I think for policymakers, it's also very difficult to be confronted with these different expectations and assumptions of the very different groups within society, civil society, communities, the private sector, and that these expectations sometimes really just don't match reality. In reality, also with recovery plans or planning for 2050, with zero emission economy, I mean, there are trade-offs, there are costs, there are inconvenient truths which have to be reflected as well when we do think about the future. So I think that is really a challenge for governments. And maybe the second last point I want to make is that neither the scientists nor the policymakers are living or acting in a void. Together with all actors of society, we are part of a value system. Their underlying norms and standards, morals, which can also obviously be different around the globe. So it's not that what we call facts or what we call knowledge is absolutely neutral. I think it's always driven also by values and morals and standards, which are maybe driven by then within a, let's say, in a political system which is more democratic, or in a political system which just might be a dictatorship. So I guess also this notion that the knowledge, what we are producing here, is absolutely independent, or that the scientist is absolutely independent from the world around him or her, I guess this is something we have to overcome. And I guess, again, I would like to come back to that point of youth, that involvement of younger generation, of young people, can really make a difference. And I think it's to an elderly generation, we really have to make sure that youth gets the place and the voice appropriate around the table. And why the foresight should be systemic, I think the point has been made by the previous speakers. Foresight should be inclusive. There is not one part of society who has the whole knowledge, and obviously should be for a whole of government approach, where again also ministries do not work in silos, but actually are looking at cross-cutting issues. And if G20 here can take the lead in establishing a foresight process with the support of S20, I think that would actually probably give a very good sign to other multilateral systems, also the UN, and obviously we find initiatives there as well. But I think it is important that we have multilateral governance systems who take foresight seriously, invest in it, make sure it is multi-actor, and review it from time to time. So if G20, S20 are ready to take here a leading role, obviously also from the International Science Council, sort of like the multilateral system for the sciences, we're obviously ready to support. Thank you. Back to you, Cyrus.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Flavia. We're going to now move to questions, and we have a question from the task force, and it is from, bear with me 1 second, from Dr. Jonathan Dawes, Professor of Applied Mathematics at the University of Bath. What is the most unexpected aspect of humanity's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, either at an international level or within one nation? And what lessons can be learned from it? So who wants to jump in? Lord Martin, your mic is muted. Microphone. Perfect.
Sorry, okay, yes. Well, I'm from the same country as the questioner, and I think one unexpected feature was the realization that inequalities are grossly excessive and unfair. What happened during the shutdown, which we had in our country, was that more privileged people kept their salaries, they went on as before, more or less, whereas those who were less advantaged were cooped up in tiny apartments, working in dangerous places, doing jobs like being bus drivers, etc., and carers, etc. And so I really feel that some people were perhaps surprised by the realization of which kinds of jobs are really important. And I really hope this will have some effect on making us realize that we need to minimize inequalities which actually were enhanced by what happened to different classes of people during the pandemic.
Very good point. Sandy?
Yeah, I have to second that. And one interpretation of what happened is all of the elites decided to do something which hurt all of the workers, and without consideration. It was just incredible, right? And of course, what the death rates in this country, this is U.S., show is that this comes on the back of a public health crisis. So many of these communities have enormous loads of disease, diabetes, other sorts of things, which are essentially being unaddressed. And the focus on the medical treatment, the remediation, meant that these people were vulnerable to anything that was a stressor, like COVID. And we saw that in these death rates. And I continue to be surprised by the lack of focus on the fact that this is fundamentally a public health crisis and not so much of a medical crisis. I mean, it's medical too, but the fundamental thing with the death rates and everything is public health.
Yes, good point. I'm going to move to the next question. Flavia, you wanted to comment?
Maybe just quickly, I mean, the surprise, and it echoes what Lord Rees and Professor Pentland said. I guess one of the surprises were really the courage of some of the frontline workers at hospitals, retirement homes, and refugee camps, where in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of the risk, they took up their responsibilities and tried to help people in danger or at risk. And I think this poses sort of like a moral obligation, a professional obligation to do well now. I mean, as a science community, but also as a science broker community, S20, G20, I mean, we owe it to all these people that we do better than we did before.
Yeah. Very relevant. Dr. Anas, given your personal background, working with smart cities, Media Lab at MIT, working with engineering system division and later the Institute for Data System and Society at MIT, you established a Center for Complex Engineering Systems at CAS and MIT, and now with King Abdulaziz City for Science and Technology and the S20. Could you tell us what is Foresight from your perspective and how it is relevant right now?
Well, let me, I think, I mean, in the previous discussion, I gave a little bit more of both background on my perspective, at least on Foresight specifically. But let me position it at least in the context of the S20 moreover. In the context of the S20, we looked initially at the Saudi Arabia's current G20 presidency and the agenda that they were looking at. And it included three main components. It included a component on empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and shaping new frontiers. And as the S20 team, we wanted to identify a set of themes really that relate to the agenda, but can in one way or another really identify something that we could also relate to more directly. So we decided on identifying the topic of health on one end. Of course, given the COVID-19 and the pandemic, it was impossible not to include health in this year's S20, of course, topics. We also wanted, so in that we mapped it to the empowering people track in the Saudi Arabia's presidency. We also looked at the topic of environment and mapped that to safeguarding the planet, and we zoomed even further in that topic to circular economies, and specifically, just to give it more also grounding. And then finally, on shaping new frontiers, we looked at the topic of digital revolution. And so those were our three main verticals that we started with. And then we wanted to look at something beyond this, and given looking at just the history and trying to map it more to the future, specifically of the G20. So if we look back at the history of the G20, initially formed as a gathering of ministers of the G20 countries, but after the 2008 financial crisis, the whole formation of the G20 changed, and that was elevated to include leaders and had many tracks evolving all around it to become more of a more inclusive type of organization. Now, with that, 12 years now later, we look at the time we're in now, and then we have this other crisis, this other, again, critical transition of COVID-19, which, as everyone on this call has been mentioning, has been not necessarily handled extremely well by any of the either organizations or countries, for that matter. So then the question becomes, what would happen 5 or 10 or 15 years from now? And this question of the future then comes into fairly strongly. If our motivation was to understand the history, then equally important is to understand where is it. Could it be the climate change? Could it be the internet crashing and all of that? So what is really that next critical transition? And so one of the major questions we started looking into is the set of what are possible critical transitions, even within certain domains. So whether it may be in health, environment, or the digital revolution. Looking at those critical transitions, similar to what Lord Martin just mentioned, but also looking not only on the risks of those, but as well at the opportunities that they may also present. And some of these critical transitions good, or are they generally on the negative side? We started this concept of thinking of the future, trying to really map a lot of adding this fourth track in the way we thought about it. So that was our horizontal, and that was the concept of foresight. And foresight as a concept is by no means new. It has been around since the mid of the last century, in the 1950s, and even prior to that. And the way we looked at this is by no means are we proposing a crystal ball for what the future should entail, but can we really develop tools and that could provide us with better planning of such futures and what they could be. And so we went back and we added this major fourth track, and then the theme of this S20 emerged as Foresight, Science for Navigating Critical Transitions. And so within that context of foresight, we looked at two real major tracks under that bigger theme, if you will. As we were trying to understand and connect the dots between the different elements and three themes, we went on pushing hard on, is today's science for foresight what we're looking for? Is it at the level beyond the simplistic type of current methodologies? And we were trying to argue in this theme of maybe it is time today to revisit what foresight is all about. And given the current advances that exist today, whether in modeling of complex systems, or our ability in understanding better networks and network science, or even our computational ability and the ability to harness data in ways we've never been able to do previously. Is it the right time to revisit what foresight is all about? So that was one major track we were trying to really push for, and as Sandy earlier mentioned, there is no doubt that today's approach of looking at things in silos or disciplines in silos was not fairly helpful in the way we were looking at this. Equally, developing newer, better tools like what Dr. Imad as well mentioned is something that we're really very keen on. So how can we look at those? The other track we also were very keen on is, can we develop better collaboration? Can we develop better mechanics for such collaboration? And this and that, I'm definitely echoing Dr. Flavia's comments on the need for better structures for such, that we do believe there is a need. So in essence, we've taken those two really tracks: better foresight research that needs to emerge as a one major area for us in this context, and better collaboration that also builds not only better research, but better trust in science and in foresight as we move forward. And I think, I'm sure my colleagues here, Professor Yoko and Dr. Ali, will elaborate further from the context of the task force and the work they've been doing. But I think those were the major drivers, if you may, in that regard. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Anas. Lord Martin, I have a question for you. You touch upon what we can learn from the current crisis, talking about a crystal ball. Would you give us your vision? What would the world be like in 2050? And again, I think you have to unmute your mic.
Yes.
Perfect.
Well, I mean, I'm very diffident. I said we can predict it will be warmer with different climate patterns, and it will be more crowded. But as to technologies, I think we've got to be careful what we predict. I mean, there's huge potential in gene editing and gene modification, which can, of course, produce better foods, etc., and could be used on human beings. But I think we're going to constrain that. The gap between what we could do and what we should do is going to get wider and wider in biology. And we're going to be lots of ethical challenges there. In the context of cyber and AI, then again, there's going to be a gap between what we can do and what we should do. In particular, we are surely going to be happy in allowing the electricity grid and things like that to be run by AI, which can process information fast. But we are not going to be happy to allow decisions that affect us as individuals to be decided. We don't really want an algorithm to decide whether we should be let out of prison, denied credit, or recommended for surgery, unless we can understand the reasoning and contest the reasoning. Even if we're told that the algorithm is on average more reliable than the human being, that's not enough. So I think it's going to be a limit in how much we allow machines to take over. But they could, of course. I mean, I mentioned in my book that the Chinese could have a planned economy of a kind that Marx could only dream of if they wished, because they have all the data in every transaction and the processing power. So they can be used to completely transform society. It's just a question of whether we do that. So that's, I think, one of the big concerns that we should have. I think we need to ask also about how fast technologies develop. I mean, of course, there have been huge developments in AI, smartphones in 10 years going right up there. But it's not clear that'll continue. I predict that the iPhones people use in 20 years' time won't be very different from the iPhone 11 now. They're saturated. We don't want it any more complicated. And we see many examples of that. Let's take flight. 50 years from Alcock and Brown crossing the Atlantic for the first time to the first jumbo jet in 1969. 50 years from 1969, still a jumbo jet. And Concorde came and went. And cars haven't changed much in the last 50 years. So there are lots of technologies which have a surge, but then because there's no demand or there are problems, they saturate. And indeed, there's a classic book by Robert Gordon who says that the inventions between 1870 and 1950 were far more important in transforming the world than anything that's happened since 1950, even including IT. And I think there's a lot in that. So we shouldn't exaggerate our extrapolations of how fast things will change in the future. But we can predict a warmer world and a more crowded world.
Thanks for this. Sandy, I have a question for you about predictive science. Do we need a new predictive science that is united so that it can provide practical guidance to policymakers?
Well, yeah, let me disagree with Lord Rees about one thing, which is the Chinese can't actually have a planned economy because we don't have the science that says if you do this, that will happen in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And the reason we don't have that is we haven't had that sort of data, and we haven't done the interdisciplinary, anti-disciplinary science to make that happen. That more sort of holistic view is something that's absolutely critical. And as I said, it's about data, it's about focused on functional things, like the climate change and things like that. But it's also about changing the way we make decisions. And I think one of the more interesting ideas that ought to be thought about within the G20, not necessarily the S20, is do we need a new sort of Bretton Woods? At the end of World War II, the world was in a condition that's actually remarkably like the one that it's in now. And it was only by coming together and agreeing on patterns of interaction and collaboration that we got ourselves out of it. And indeed had somewhat of a golden period for the next 20, 30 years. We can do that again, or we cannot. And we need to be able to think about how can we set up these patterns of collaboration being enabled by the digital technologies like we're using right now, so that we can go much faster and respond to the much faster pace of problems that we're facing.
But I just add that I think we need a new mega Marshall Plan for Africa.
Yeah, that's an example. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Noted the call for Marshall Plan for Africa. Emad, how can we better align differing groups around foresight when its uncertainty means no consensus?
Thank you, Cyrus. I think some excellent points kind of made here. It's like a Bretton Woods kind of approach, and this Marshall Plan for Africa, etc. It's really tough kind of agreeing on where you're going to go. I think all of us experienced that when we are setting out on road trips, and now when sending our kids back to school or trying to decide whether or not we should travel, etc. I think that the role of entities such as the G20, the UN, and others is essential in this. But also we need to provide them with the tools to augment their existing abilities. I think that so much knowledge is exchanged on calls such as this and others that kind of needs to be mapped and made more available and accessible, because a large part of kind of consensus building now, and like I said, it's changed, is that you have to be able to keep up with the pace of differing circumstances and change. You need to have the right frameworks. So that's kind of what we were trying to do at CAIAC by bringing in the UN entities and others, World Bank, WHO, etc., and then engaging with the top academic institutions, etc. But you have to align the competing interests in a very, very organized way. And I think that the only way that you can really do that is if you take the different interests and you were very straightforward about it and then collapse it down to the key points of agreement and then work from there. I don't think it's, that viable when people can't agree on the very basic things due to political factors. And I think that as well, a large part of the difficulty on the Foresight part has occurred because new actors have come in, or say certain actors that you should have relied upon about contributing to a positive sum game, suddenly decided to go and try and buy the world's vaccines and other things. So we have lots of these Foresight seminars and kind of plans, etc. We have to make sure that anything that we do on a Foresight basis is not only aligning with the principles that are clearly defined, that everyone agrees upon, a priori, but can also adapt to when you have renegade kind of elements coming in, changing the rules of the game. Because under periods of stress, and we're only going to face more stress going forward, we have to assume that people will devolve from acting in humanity's best interests or society's best interests to their own personal self-interests, because that's both our major benefit as a species, that we can scale up and change the world as a human colossus. But then when backs are to the wall, you look out for your own. And I think we're on that teetering edge here. And we have to be so careful about trying to augment our existing systems to be able to deal with that when it occurs.
Thanks, Ahmad. Last question is going to be for Flavia before opening the floor for the remarks from the task force lead. So Flavia, what are the critical factors for policymakers to include foresight in their decision making?
Well, I think when we're talking here about the Marshall Plan for Africa, and maybe I would even say a systemic Marshall Plan for the whole of the planet, I think we need educated global citizens, because these politicians are not just coming on their own. I mean, they're, if the country is lucky, they are actually elected. So I guess for the politicians, I mean, the balancing of short-term economic interests and the science and the knowledge we have right now with whatever the civil society is asking for, the security, the safety they're asking for, I think that's a difficult one to balance. And I think a critical relation for the policymakers and the governments is the one with the science sector, but also with the private sector, because if we really get the economics right in the future, degrowth, decoupling, obviously, green zero emission and all that, if that is reflected appropriately in the recovery plans, I think then we can create an alternative future which really leaves an opening for sustainable solutions to the world that Lord Rees has described. But if policymakers keep going on and becoming more nationalistic, more polarized, more driving some identity politics, I think then we're kind of doomed. So I guess what we have to do is really, we need leaders like the G20, we need science leading collaboratives like the S20, which actually really bring across the message that this is here about collaboration within a country, within regions, and globally.
Excellent point and very pertinent again. We're opening the floor now to the S20 Foresight Task Force co-leads who will present their recommendation. Dr. Yoko Shimpuku, the floor is yours.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Thank you very much. It has been indeed a rewarding journey to be part of this task force, working along with so many exceptional and talented people from around the world. I was truly inspired and learned a lot from today's panelists as well. I've had the chance to witness very stimulating and inspiring discussions that culminated in the final policy paper and communique. The introduction of foresight science as a tool to help us navigate future transitions will come with demanding challenges, but also unique opportunities. In order to address these and other challenges that will be brought by current and future critical transitions, the G20 Academies of Science recommend the following actions. 1. Advance existing pandemic preparedness toward an internationally collaborative framework to monitor and respond rapidly to emerging diseases and handle future pandemics. 2. Promote advanced therapies and precision medicine research to enhance personalized care with a view to concurrently improve technology, cost, and accessibility. 3. Deploy policies and interventions to address the challenges arising from demographic shifts. 4. Develop an integrated and efficient closed-loop systems approach to natural resource extraction, distribution, consumption, disposal, and recycling. 5. Promote circular design of materials and energy systems through advancing the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, plus renewables aimed at net zero carbon emission. 6. Bridge the emerging digital divide to ensure that all people on the planet have access and capability to use digital technologies and the internet while ensuring privacy, resilience, and security of digital networks and devices. 7. Improve the sustainability of the digital infrastructure, including end-user devices, and improve opportunities for smart city technologies to contribute towards a cleaner environment. 8. Adopt a multidisciplinary approach to plan a human-centric, digitally enabled society of the future in which the digital infrastructure is fully embedded in the entire social, educational, political, business, and cultural landscape. 9. Support foresight research that is based on robust science, repeatable methods, and open sharing, and incorporates recent advances in complex system analysis. 10. Establish a platform upon which to implement and foster international collaboration and to build trust in foresight research and activities. It's my belief that foresight could help us address real-world issues that relate to all the task force themes and require our urgent attention, with particular regard for how they interconnect and their potential to improve or affect our daily lives. As the colleague of Task Force 4, I wanted to thank everyone who has been part of this task force, as each one of you has been crucial in every step that brought us to where we are today. Thank you very much, and I hope we will continue working together in the future.
Thank you very much, Yoko. Dr. Ali Mashari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cyrus. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ali Mashari, and I'm leading Task Force 4 on Foresight, connecting the dots from science to action. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Yoko Shimboku for staying with us until this late time. So thank you very much, and thanks for all the efforts during this really very interesting, challenging, and really great team that we had together. I would like to thank every member involved in this team, and also I would like to thank Yara and her team for making this webinar possible, and really great one. As you know, there has been tremendous amount of work done by a very wide range of experts, scientists, science academies, and support teams around the world to reach this point. I'm really very thankful to you all for your outstanding efforts for what we have achieved in this time working together. Also, many thanks and appreciation to the moderator of this webinar and the exceptional panel of distinguished speakers. We have heard from Cyrus, the esteemed panelist today, and other task force during previous webinars. The world needs to prepare for many critical transitions in the near future. These transitions relate to crucial topics such as health, the environment, and the technological revolutions we are already undergoing. As Lord Rees explained, prolonged pandemics will probably become more common and will highlight the serious gaps in digital infrastructure among vulnerable populations. Significant demographic shifts will also occur due to changing birth rates, aging populations, migration, and urbanization. The unsustainable use of resources and waste generation will test our capacity to migrate to circular economy where we reduce, reuse, repair, refurbish, and recycle while we maintain focus on economic development and the reduction of carbon emissions. In Task Force 4, Foresight, Connecting the Dots, our task was to visualize interconnectedness of these and other global issues and see how the dots connect across various task forces. In that regard, the year 2020 has been one of the most challenging years the world has seen in modern times, but also an undeniable example of how connected and complex our planet really is. Not only economies around the planet have been severely disrupted, but also the way we human beings interact with one another. All this is great, all this at a great cost of a human life. This situation, however, is also a golden opportunity for mankind. As the world's economy came to a halt, we have given ourselves time to observe, to analyze the transitions of our world, and to think deeply about the planet we want to hand over to our children. Foresight science method, as hinted by Mr. Imad and Dr. Shelgil, will play a key role in this regard, providing us with a platform to better equip ourselves for similar future events that eventually will shape the way we live. In the journey of introducing Foresight science and understand what capabilities are required, as mentioned by Dr. Anas Al-Faris, we will face various challenges in reaching our goals of better health, societal, environmental, and economic conditions. Some of these challenges will relate to limited expertise, infrastructure, funding, data sharing, and collaboration, which were touched upon by Professor Bentland between public and private institutions. Others will relate to many policymakers' lack of awareness of Foresight science and to underestimation of the complexities created by an increasingly connected world. As Task Force 4, it was our task to discuss these challenges and address them through policy recommendations that are outlined as part of our final communiqué and that was discussed by my colleague previously, Dr. Yoko Shimboko. As the lead of Task Force 4, I want to reiterate my highest regards for all Task Force 4 team members for your professionalism and for the truly exceptional work that you have delivered during this journey. And thank you again for everybody participated in this webinar. CAIAC, CAUST, there is a huge team behind all what we did, and without their outstanding support, especially from our chair, Dr. Anas Al-Faris, we will not reach this moment. Thanks again for this great webinar, for the moderator and the exceptional panel of distinguished speakers. Thank you very much. And back to you again, Cyrus.
Thank you so much for these closing remarks almost, Ali. Ali, I'm going to leave the floor now. Thank you everyone for the stimulating conversation and leave the floor to Yara for the closing remarks, actually.
Thank you, everyone. That definitely was a great discussion and great dialogue that brought different perspectives from pioneering experts, from different fields. I thank every one of you. I thank Cyrus. I thank also the audience for attending and for sticking with us, even though we went a little over time. I thank you again, and I do invite you to the final and last webinars of the webinar series, of the S20's webinar series, coming up next week on the 21st of September, a very special one titled Women in Science, and it's also with our partner, Princess Noor University. We look forward for you to join us then, and thanks again to everyone.